The room is quiet except for the sound of laboured breathing. It is September 23rd, 1939, and an old man lies dying in a house in Hampstead, London. His jaw is grotesquely distorted from 16 years of surgery, 33 operations that have carved away half his face in a futile attempt to stop the cancer spreading through his mouth. He can barely speak. When he does, his words emerge through a prosthetic device that holds the remaining structure of his palate together. The late afternoon light filters through the curtains, casting shadows across the room. The walls are lined with books, floor to ceiling, volumes in German, English, French, Italian, Spanish. Between the bookshelves stand glass cabinets displaying ancient figurines, Egyptian gods, Greek heroes, Roman emperors. The old man collected them obsessively for decades, seeing in these artifacts from dead civilizations something that spoke to his understanding of the human mind. Each statue represents a fragment of humanity's attempt to give form to invisible forces, to make concrete the abstract terrors and desires that haunt consciousness. 3 weeks ago, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. The world is descending into war, but this man, who spent his life investigating the hidden violence of the human psyche, is past caring about the external battlefield. He has fought his own war for 83 years, and now he is ready to surrender. His physician, Max Schur, stands beside the bed. They made an agreement years ago when the pain became unmanageable. Now the old man looks at Schur and says, "You promised me you would help me when I could no longer carry on. Now it is nothing but torture and makes no sense anymore." Schur understands. He has been treating Freud since 1928, has witnessed the progressive destruction wrought by the cancer, has watched his patient maintain intellectual work through agony that would have broken most men. The request is not impulsive. They have discussed it for years, philosophically at first, then practically. Freud has always been clear: when the mind can no longer function, when pain becomes the totality of existence, he wants release. He does not believe in an afterlife. Death is simply the cessation of suffering, the return to the inorganic state that preceded birth. There is no reason to prolong consciousness when consciousness has become unbearable. Schur administers morphine, then more morphine. The dosage is deliberate, calculated to bring unconsciousness without immediate death, to ease the transition rather than precipitate it violently. The old man slips into unconsciousness. He will never wake. On his bedside table lies a book, Balzac's The Fatal Skin, a story about a man whose every wish brings him closer to death. It is a fitting final text for Sigmund Freud, the doctor who built an empire on the idea that we are all driven by wishes we dare not acknowledge, desires that shape our lives from depths we cannot see. Before we explore how this Jewish physician from a failing wool merchant's family became the architect of psychoanalysis, the man who convinced the 20th century that dreams mean something, that children have sexual feelings, that we spend our lives unconsciously repeating patterns established before we could speak, take a moment to help this documentary reach more people. Click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support makes these deep explorations possible, and I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you joining me from today? Drop a comment and let me know. Your presence here matters. Now let us travel backward to a small Moravian town in 1856 to understand how a boy born into provincial obscurity would become the most controversial mind explorer in history. The journey begins not in Vienna, though that is where Freud spent nearly his entire life, but in Freiburg, a town most people have never heard of, in circumstances that would mark him forever. On May 6, 1856, Amalia Nathanson Freud gives birth to her first child in a room above a blacksmith shop. She is 21 years old, married to a wool merchant named Jacob, who is 40 years her senior. This age gap is not the strangest thing about the household. Jacob has been married twice before. He has 2 adult sons from his first marriage, Emmanuel and Philip, who are closer in age to Amalia than Jacob is. When Sigmund is born, his half-brother Emmanuel already has a son older than the infant uncle. The family constellation is twisted from the start. The apartment smells of wool and coal smoke. Through the floorboards come the sounds of the blacksmith's hammer, rhythmic and relentless. Amalia, young and beautiful and trapped in a provincial town with an elderly husband, focuses all her fierce energy on the wrinkled infant in her arms. She calls him Mein goldener Siggi, my golden Sigmund. She will have 7 more children, but none will ever displace the firstborn from his position of privilege. Sigmund learns to walk in rooms crowded with siblings, half-siblings, and his nephew John, who is older than him despite being technically junior in family hierarchy. The confusion of relationships, the blurred boundaries between generations, the sense that family roles are unstable and ambiguous, all of this imprints on the child's developing mind. Later, when Freud constructs theories about how children understand family relationships, about the Oedipal triangle of mother, father, and child, his own bewildering family structure will invisibly shape his thinking. Freud will later write that a man who has been the indisputable favorite of his mother carries a feeling of being a conqueror through life. He is describing himself. Amalia's adoration wraps around young Sigmund like armor. When he cries, she comes immediately. When he wants something, she provides it if possible. The other children learn early that Sigmund's needs come first. He is special, destined for greatness. Amalia repeats this conviction constantly as though saying it can make it true. But conquest requires resources, and the Freud family has none. Jacob's wool trade is collapsing. The railroad has bypassed Freiburg, routing commerce through larger cities. The cottage industry that sustained Jewish merchants like Jacob is dying, strangled by industrial production and changing trade routes. Money becomes scarce. Debts accumulate. The family's position in Freiburg becomes untenable. When Sigmund is 3, the family leaves Moravia. The departure is hasty, almost a flight. There are rumors about why Jacob left, whispers of financial impropriety, questions about debts unpaid. Whether these rumors are true is unclear, but the family does not return. They travel first to Leipzig, then, when Sigmund is 4, to Vienna. The journey to Vienna is long and confusing for a child. Sigmund will later remember fragments: the train carriage rocking, gas lamps visible through windows in the darkness, his mother's face illuminated strangely. At some point during the journey he catches a glimpse of his mother undressing, a flash of nakedness that burns into memory, though he does not understand why it disturbs him. Decades later, analyzing his own dreams and memories, Freud will interpret this glimpse as sexually significant, as awakening desires he could not yet comprehend. Whether this interpretation is accurate or an adult projection onto childhood experience is unknowable, but the memory persists. Vienna in 1860 is the capital of an empire, but it is an empire beginning to crack. The Habsburg domains stretch across Central Europe, holding together Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Italians, Serbs, and Jews through a combination of bureaucratic efficiency and imperial myth. The city itself is magnificent, about to enter its golden age of art and music and coffee houses. The Ringstrasse is under construction, replacing medieval walls with grand boulevards lined with monumental buildings. Opera houses and museums rise from construction sites. Vienna is becoming the cultural center of Central Europe. But for a Jewish family arriving with nothing, Vienna is also a trap. They settle in Leopoldstadt, the Jewish quarter, across the Danube Canal from the city center. The apartment is cramped, dark, and cold in winter. 7 people occupy rooms designed for 4. Privacy is impossible. The building reeks of cabbage and onions from neighbouring kitchens. The courtyard is muddy and filled with refuse. This is not the Vienna of palaces and opera, but the Vienna of poverty and overcrowding that tourists never see. Jacob's business never recovers. He tries to establish himself as a wool merchant in Vienna, but the market is already saturated with competitors who have better connections and more capital. Money is always scarce. The family moves frequently, always to cheaper apartments, always in Leopoldstadt. Amalia compensates for material poverty with emotional intensity. She pours her frustrated ambition into her golden Sigmund, creating in him the conviction that he is destined for greatness, even as evidence suggests otherwise. The boy is brilliant. This is not myth or maternal exaggeration. He enters the Leopoldstädter communal real gymnasium at age 9 and excels immediately. The gymnasium is a classical education institution demanding rigor in languages, literature, mathematics, and sciences. Sigmund devours the curriculum. He reads Shakespeare in English before he is 12, working through the plays with a dictionary at his side, absorbed by the psychological complexity of characters like Hamlet and Macbeth, men torn between conscious intention and unconscious resistance. He teaches himself Spanish to read Cervantes's Don Quixote in the original, finding in the knight's delusional quest something both comic and tragic, a portrait of how imagination can override reality. He wins prizes for translating Greek and Latin, rendering Homer and Virgil into German with a facility that impresses his teachers. The ancient texts speak to him, the Greek tragedies especially, with their themes of fate, guilt, and hidden crimes returning to destroy families, resonate with something in his psychology he cannot yet articulate. The other children in the family are not allowed to play musical instruments because it might disturb Sigmund's studies. When his sister Anna receives a piano, Sigmund complains that the noise interferes with his concentration. The piano is removed. Amalia's favoritism is not subtle. She will sacrifice anything, including the happiness of her other children, to support Sigmund's intellectual development. But brilliance in a Jewish child in Habsburg Vienna is not a simple advantage. Austria granted Jews full civil rights in 1867 when Freud was 11. Legal equality exists on paper. Jews can own property, attend university, enter professions previously closed to them, but social acceptance does not follow legal emancipation. Anti-Semitism remains pervasive, sometimes subtle, sometimes explicit. Jews are tolerated in the professions but excluded from the upper reaches of society. A Jewish doctor can practice medicine but will never be appointed to a major hospital directorship. A Jewish scientist can publish research but will struggle to obtain a university professorship. Freud will later recount a story his father told him about walking down a street when a Christian knocked the cap from Jacob's head and shouted, "Jew, get off the pavement!" Young Sigmund asks what his father did. Jacob admits he picked up his cap and walked away. He did not confront the man, did not defend his dignity, simply submitted to the humiliation. The story burns itself into Freud's psyche. He is ashamed of his father's passivity. Jacob seems weak, defeated, too old and tired to fight back. Sigmund fantasizes about being different, about responding to aggression with aggression. He identifies not with his father, but with historical figures who used force and cunning to overthrow oppressors. He admires Hannibal, the Semitic general who brought Rome to its knees, marching elephants across the Alps in a campaign of vengeance. He reads about the conquistadors who overthrew the Aztec and Inca empires with small forces amplified by audacity and ruthlessness. These are the heroes young Freud identifies with, outsiders who used intelligence and determination to overturn existing orders. The identification is psychological compensation. Freud cannot change his circumstances through physical courage. He is a slight, bookish boy in a poor Jewish family, but he can fantasize about intellectual conquest, about achieving greatness through mental rather than martial prowess. In 1873, at age 17, Freud enters the University of Vienna to study medicine. He does not particularly want to be a physician. The sight of blood makes him uncomfortable. Clinical work, treating individual patients with individual ailments, seems intellectually limiting. But medicine is the only route to scientific and intellectual life available to someone of his background. Jews are effectively barred from academic careers in the humanities. They can enter law, but law means serving the existing social order, helping wealthy clients navigate commercial disputes. Medicine offers a path to research, to making discoveries, to achieving something that will write his name in history. What Freud wants, though he does not articulate it clearly even to himself, is to be remembered. He wants to matter, to achieve something permanent. The fantasy of greatness that Amalia instilled in him has become the organizing principle of his life. Ordinary success is not enough. He must be extraordinary. In an age when physics and chemistry are revealing the hidden mechanisms of nature, when Darwin has explained the origin of species and Maxwell has unified electricity and magnetism, Freud believes biology might do the same for human beings. Somewhere in the nervous system, in the structure and function of nerve cells, lies the explanation for thought, emotion, and behavior. He is drawn to the laboratory of Ernst Brücke, a physiologist who represents everything Freud aspires to: rigorous scientific method, Germanic precision, the reduction of living processes to physical and chemical laws. Brücke's institute is investigating the nervous system using the best tools available in 1876, which means dissecting eels and examining nerve cells under microscopes. The laboratory is located in a converted gun factory, all high ceilings and drafty halls. The rooms smell of formaldehyde and alcohol. Microscopes line the benches, gleaming instruments of brass and glass. Freud spends hours hunched over slides, adjusting focus, sketching what he sees through the eyepiece. The work is painstaking and often frustrating. Nerve cells are difficult to visualize. The staining techniques are unreliable. Many days produce nothing but failed preparations and eye strain. But Freud persists. He is investigating the testes of eels, trying to locate the elusive male reproductive cells that no one has definitively identified. He dissects hundreds of eels, searching for structures that match theoretical predictions. The work is unglamorous, repetitive, and requires patience that does not come naturally to someone with Freud's ambition, but it teaches him method, teaches him that knowledge comes from careful observation rather than speculation. He spends 6 years in Brücke's institute from 1876 to 1882, investigating nerve cells, publishing papers on neurological anatomy, absorbing the worldview that would shape his entire career. That organisms are dynamic systems governed by forces, that nothing in nature occurs without cause, that even the most complex phenomena can be analyzed and understood if approached with sufficient rigor. Brücke becomes a father figure to Freud in a way Jacob never was. Where Jacob is passive and defeated, Brücke is authoritative and demanding. He expects excellence and does not tolerate sloppiness. When Freud produces substandard work, Brücke's disapproval is withering. When Freud produces good work, Brücke's approval is deeply satisfying. Freud works to earn that approval with an intensity that reveals how much he needs paternal validation, real validation based on achievement rather than Amalia's unconditional adoration. Under Brücke's supervision, Freud publishes several papers on neurological anatomy. The work is competent, methodical, but not extraordinary. He discovers some minor structures, contributes to the gradual accumulation of anatomical knowledge, but makes no breakthroughs. He is one promising researcher among many, contributing incrementally to a collective project. Academic science could absorb him, give him a career as a lecturer and laboratory researcher, but it would not make him great. The path to a professorship would take decades. Advancement depends on seniority, political maneuvering, and being in the right place when positions open. Freud does not have decades to wait, and as a Jew, his prospects for advancement are limited regardless of merit. Then practical reality intrudes in the form of love. In 1882, Freud meets Martha Bernays at his sister's house. She is the daughter of a prominent Jewish family, better connected than the Freuds, more cultured. Her grandfather was the chief rabbi of Hamburg. Her family has intellectual credentials and social standing that the Freuds lack. She is beautiful, with dark eyes and a quiet, composed demeanor that contrasts with Amalia's overwhelming intensity. Freud falls in love with an intensity that borders on obsession. Within weeks of meeting her, he is convinced she is the only woman he could marry. He begins courting her with a ferocity that seems designed to overcome any possible resistance. He writes her letters, long, passionate letters analyzing his feelings, describing his ambitions, demanding reassurance of her affection. He becomes jealous of any man who speaks to her. He wants to possess her completely, to merge with her, to make her the audience for his life. Martha is initially uncertain. Freud is brilliant, but poor, intense, but unstable, ambitious, but without clear prospects. Her family is skeptical. Why should she marry a laboratory researcher with no income when she could find someone established, someone who could provide security? But Freud's intensity is overwhelming. He pursues her relentlessly, argues down her objections, makes her feel that refusing him would be a moral failure. Within months, they are engaged. But engagement is not marriage, and marriage requires money. Freud is surviving on a small stipend from Brücker's laboratory. He has no savings. He cannot support a wife, and he certainly cannot support the family he wants to have. He goes to Brücker and asks about his prospects for advancement. Brücker is honest. There are two positions ahead of Freud, both occupied by men only slightly older than him. It could be 10 or 15 years before a position opens. Even then, appointment is not guaranteed. Advancement in academic science is slow and uncertain. Freud cannot afford to wait. He makes a decision that shapes everything that follows. He leaves Brücker's Institute in 1882 and begins training as a clinical physician at Vienna General Hospital. The decision is pragmatic, almost mercenary. He does not want to be a physician, but medicine pays better than laboratory work. If he can establish a private practice treating wealthy patients, he can marry Martha and support a family. For the next 3 years, he moves through rotations in surgery, internal medicine, psychiatry, ophthalmology, and dermatology. The training is rigorous and exhausting. He works long hours in crowded wards filled with the sick and dying. Vienna General Hospital is one of Europe's largest medical institutions, treating thousands of patients from across the empire. The wards reek of infection and disinfectant. Patients lie in rows, separated only by curtains. Many die. Freud learns to diagnose pneumonia, typhoid, tuberculosis, syphilis. He learns surgical techniques, though he dislikes surgery and is not particularly skilled with his hands. He is competent but not distinguished. Clinical medicine, with its emphasis on treating symptoms and providing comfort, does not satisfy him intellectually. Medicine in 1880s Vienna is still largely empirical. Doctors prescribe remedies based on tradition and experience without understanding mechanisms. They treat fever without knowing what causes it. They prescribe mercury for syphilis without understanding why it sometimes helps. The whole practice seems intellectually unsatisfying to someone trained in Brücker's laboratory to seek underlying mechanisms and causal explanations. During this period, he makes the first great mistake of his career, a mistake that will teach him lessons about the dangers of enthusiasm unchecked by skepticism. In 1884, Freud learns about a substance called cocaine, recently isolated from coca leaves, that South American indigenous peoples have chewed for centuries. The substance has stimulant properties. It relieves fatigue and elevates mood. Some researchers believe it might have therapeutic applications. Freud begins researching the literature on cocaine, reading everything available in German, French, and English. He becomes convinced that cocaine has remarkable therapeutic properties that have been overlooked. Most research has focused on coca leaves. Little work has been done on pure cocaine. Freud sees an opportunity to make a discovery, to be the first to systematically investigate cocaine's medical potential. He begins experimenting on himself, a practice that would be unethical by modern standards, but was common in 19th century medicine. He takes cocaine and records the subjective effects in meticulous detail. The drug produces euphoria, increased energy, mental clarity. He feels more confident, more articulate, able to work longer without fatigue. He gives cocaine to his fiancée Martha to make her strong and give her cheeks a red color. He gives it to colleagues. He sends some to his sister. The subjective effects are so positive that Freud becomes convinced he has found something important. He writes a paper, Über Coca, published in July 1884, enthusiastically recommending cocaine for depression, digestive problems, asthma, and morphine addiction. The paper is rapturous in tone, almost evangelistic. Freud describes cocaine as a magical substance, a cure for malaise and fatigue. He barely mentions potential dangers because he has not observed any. His own use has been entirely positive. Why would anyone experience problems? He nearly achieves his first major discovery when a colleague, Karl Koller, realizes cocaine can be used as a local anesthetic in eye surgery. Freud had noticed that cocaine numbs the tongue and suggested this property might have surgical applications, but he did not pursue the idea immediately. He was planning to visit Martha, who was living in Hamburg with her family. Surgery could wait. Koller, working in ophthalmology, immediately recognized the significance. He experimented on animal eyes, then human eyes, and published the discovery. The use of cocaine as a local anesthetic revolutionizes surgery. Koller becomes famous. Freud, who was so close to the discovery, gets nothing but the knowledge that he missed his chance through lack of urgency. Then the truth about cocaine emerges, slowly at first, then undeniably. It is not a miracle cure, it is addictive. Patients who use it regularly develop tolerance, needing higher doses to achieve the same effects. When they stop using it, they experience crushing depression and fatigue. Some develop paranoia and hallucinations. The drug that seemed magical reveals its dark side. One of Freud's friends, Ernst Fleischl von Marxow, becomes a cocaine addict after Freud prescribes it to treat his morphine addiction. Fleischl had become addicted to morphine after a surgical amputation left him in chronic pain. Freud, convinced that cocaine could cure addiction, encouraged Fleischl to substitute cocaine for morphine. Instead, Fleischl becomes addicted to both substances. His health deteriorates catastrophically. He experiences hallucinations, believing insects are crawling under his skin. He becomes paranoid and violent. In 1891, he dies, destroyed by the addictions Freud helped create. The medical community turns on Freud. Critics accuse him of promoting a dangerous drug irresponsibly. Some call him a menace. The episode damages his reputation for years. Colleagues who might have referred patients to him keep their distance. The man who wanted to be famous for a great discovery becomes infamous for a terrible mistake. But the cocaine episode also teaches Freud brutal lessons that will shape his later work. He learns that enthusiasm must be tempered by caution, that the desire to make a great discovery can cloud judgment. That subjective experience is unreliable evidence. What felt true, the euphoria and clarity cocaine provided, was not truth but chemical manipulation. The episode also reveals something about Freud's intellectual temperament. He is willing to experiment on himself, to take risks with his own body and mind in pursuit of knowledge. This willingness to use introspection as data, to treat subjective experience as valid evidence, will become central to psychoanalysis, but the cocaine disaster teaches him that introspection alone is insufficient. In 1885, an opportunity arrives that will change everything and set Freud on the path towards psychoanalysis. He receives a traveling fellowship to study in Paris with Jean-Martin Charcot, the most famous neurologist in Europe. The fellowship is competitive. Freud's application emphasizes his laboratory experience and publications. The selection committee awards him a modest grant for several months of study in Paris. It is a chance to learn from the best, to make connections, to see something beyond Vienna. Freud arrives in Paris in October 1885. The city overwhelms him. It is larger, more cosmopolitan, more artistically vital than Vienna. The boulevards are wider, the buildings more elegant. Parisians seem more sophisticated, more alive. Freud, who has spent his entire life in the narrow world of Vienna's Jewish quarter and the university, feels provincial and unsophisticated by comparison. Charcot runs the Salpêtrière Hospital, an enormous institution housing thousands of patients. The Salpêtrière was originally built as a gunpowder factory, then converted to a hospital and hospice for indigent women. It is a city within the city, with its own streets, chapel, and gardens. Charcot's neurology service occupies one section treating patients with epilepsy, hysteria, and other nervous disorders. Charcot himself is a commanding figure, elegant and theatrical. He dresses impeccably and lectures with dramatic flair. His weekly demonstrations attract not only medical students but artists, writers, and society figures curious about the spectacle of hysteria. The demonstrations follow a pattern. Charcot presents a patient, usually a young woman, and describes her symptoms. Then he hypnotizes her and demonstrates how symptoms can be induced and removed through suggestion. Freud watches these demonstrations with fascination. Charcot hypnotizes a patient named Blanche Wittmann and suggests she cannot move her arm. The arm becomes paralyzed, hanging limp and unresponsive. He touches her arm with a tuning fork and suggests she feels intense pain. She screams. He removes the tuning fork and suggests the pain is gone. She relaxes. He hypnotizes her again and suggests the paralysis is gone. Movement returns. The patient can raise her arm normally as though nothing had happened. The implications are stunning. If symptoms can be created and destroyed by verbal suggestion, they cannot be purely organic. Paralysis caused by nerve damage does not disappear when someone suggests it should, but hysterical paralysis does. Something psychological must be involved, some mechanism by which ideas and beliefs affect the body's functioning. Charcot demonstrates something else important. Hysterical symptoms follow psychological rather than anatomical logic. A patient has glove anesthesia, losing sensation in her hand and wrist in a pattern that corresponds to wearing a glove. But nerve damage does not produce glove anesthesia. The nerves of the arm do not map onto the hand in a way that would create sensation loss, shaped like a glove. Anatomically, the symptom makes no sense. Psychologically, it makes perfect sense. The patient thinks of her hand as a unit, shaped like a glove, and the symptom follows that mental representation rather than anatomical reality. Freud absorbs these demonstrations with growing excitement. Here is a phenomenon that cannot be explained by nerve lesions or brain damage, yet it is real, observable, repeatable. Hysteria is a disorder of the mind affecting the body, and somehow verbal suggestion can alter it. This is the crack in the edifice of biological materialism that Freud has been waiting for without knowing it. If ideas can cause paralysis, if words can remove symptoms, then mind and body are connected in ways that pure neurology cannot explain. He attends Charcot's lectures religiously, takes notes, and volunteers to translate Charcot's work into German. Charcot is flattered by the intense young Austrian's attention. He allows Freud access to patients and discusses cases with him. The relationship is not close. Charcot is too famous and too busy to mentor an unknown foreign student individually, but it is warm enough that Freud feels recognized and valued. The months in Paris are transformative. Freud returns to Vienna in February 1886 with new ideas, new ambitions, and no reputation beyond being the man who promoted cocaine disastrously. He opens a private practice treating nervous disorders, advertising himself as skilled in electrotherapy and hypnosis. He marries Martha Bernays in September 1886, after a 4-year engagement marked by hundreds of letters and frequent conflicts about money, family, and jealousy. The marriage is conventional in structure but complicated in emotional dynamics. Martha is dutiful, supportive, and traditional. She manages the household, raises the children, they will eventually have 6, and creates domestic stability that allows Freud to work. But she does not understand his intellectual life. She does not read his papers or discuss his theories. Freud keeps his professional and domestic lives separate. Martha is the wife who provides order and children. Intellectual companionship comes from male colleagues and later from a few female analysans who become confidants. Patients do not arrive easily. The Viennese medical establishment is skeptical of the young doctor who studied in Paris and comes back talking about hysteria and hypnosis. Hysteria is considered a minor disorder, if not outright malingering. Serious physicians treat serious diseases, tuberculosis, syphilis, cancer. Treating wealthy women who claim to be paralyzed despite having nothing physically wrong seems like pandering to female weakness and bourgeois self-indulgence. Freud struggles financially during the first years of practice. The apartment he rents for his growing family is modest. Martha economizes constantly, making clothes last, serving cheap cuts of meat. Freud sees patients in the morning and afternoon, writes in the evening, and worries constantly about money. He needs patients, but patients do not come. He needs referrals from established physicians, but established physicians do not trust him. During this difficult period, he begins collaborating more intensely with Joseph Breuer, an older, more established physician who had treated a patient named Bertha Pappenheim, known in case studies as Anna O. Breuer, is everything Freud is not: respected, financially secure, connected to Vienna's medical elite. He is also generous enough to refer patients to the younger man and discuss cases with him as an equal. Breuer tells Freud about Bertha Pappenheim in detail, and the case becomes foundational to psychoanalysis. Bertha was a highly intelligent young woman from a respectable Jewish family. In 1880, at age 21, she began developing bizarre symptoms while caring for her dying father. She developed paralysis in her limbs, disturbances of vision, and a nervous cough. She experienced hallucinations, seeing black snakes and death's heads. Most strangely, she developed a dissociated state where she could only speak English, though German was her native language, and she had spoken it fluently her entire life. Breuer treated her with hypnosis, not to remove symptoms directly through suggestion as Charcot did, but by having her talk about her experiences. Under hypnosis, Bertha would recall specific incidents and describe them in elaborate detail. Breuer noticed that when she talked about the first occurrence of a particular symptom, that symptom would disappear, at least temporarily. She called it the talking cure, or chimney sweeping, as though talking cleaned out mental debris. For example, Bertha's nervous cough had begun when she was sitting at her father's bedside and heard dance music from a neighboring apartment. She felt an impulse to be at the dance, immediately felt guilty for wanting pleasure while her father suffered, and developed a cough. When she recalled this incident under hypnosis and expressed the conflicting feelings, the cough disappeared. Breuer treated Bertha for nearly 2 years, seeing her almost daily. The treatment was intense, arguably too intense. Breuer became deeply involved emotionally. Bertha developed strong feelings toward him. The relationship took on undertones that made Breuer's wife, Matilda, jealous and uncomfortable. Eventually, Breuer terminated the treatment abruptly. He later told Freud that Bertha had developed a hysterical pregnancy, believing herself pregnant with Breuer's child despite no sexual contact. Whether this actually happened or was Breuer's retrospective justification for ending an uncomfortably intense relationship is disputed. Freud finds the case fascinating. The idea that talking about traumatic memories can relieve symptoms suggests a mechanism. The patient experiences trauma, the experience creates psychic tension, the tension converts into physical symptoms, and verbal expression discharges the tension. It is a hydraulic model, treating psychic energy like a fluid that can build up pressure and be released. The model fits with the physics of the time, with thermodynamic concepts of energy, work, and discharge. Freud and Breuer publish Studies on Hysteria in 1895, presenting this theory and several case studies. The book proposes that hysterical symptoms result from traumatic memories that have been repressed. The patient experiences trauma, the memory is too disturbing to remain in consciousness, and the psyche represses it, pushes it out of awareness. But the psychic energy of the repressed memory does not disappear. It converts into physical symptoms. Treatment involves helping the patient remember and verbally express the repressed trauma. Once the memory is conscious and articulated, the trapped energy is discharged and the symptom vanishes. The theory is elegant, mechanistic, and seems to explain clinical observations, but it rests on a foundation Freud has not yet examined critically. What causes repression? Why do some memories become unbearable and get forced out of consciousness? The studies on hysteria describe the mechanism of symptom formation, but not the ultimate cause. Freud begins to notice a disturbing pattern in his patients' accounts. When he presses them to describe the earliest traumatic event, the original trauma from which symptoms developed, they describe sexual experiences in childhood. Often, they report seduction or molestation by an adult, frequently a father, uncle, or family friend. This pattern emerges again and again across different patients from different families. The specifics vary, but the core narrative is consistent: childhood sexual abuse followed by repression, followed by neurotic symptoms in adulthood. In 1896, Freud proposes what he calls the seduction theory. Neurosis results from actual childhood sexual abuse. The trauma of premature sexual experience is so overwhelming that the child's mind represses it, and the repressed trauma manifests later as neurotic symptoms in adolescence or adulthood. The theory makes intuitive sense. It locates the cause of neurosis in external events, in real traumas inflicted on children by adults. It makes neurosis a consequence of victimization, not constitutional weakness or moral failure. But the theory also carries disturbing implications. If Freud is right, childhood sexual abuse is far more common than anyone wants to believe. His patients come from respectable Viennese families, the educated bourgeoisie and minor aristocracy. He is claiming that fathers, uncles, and brothers are molesting children at epidemic rates, and that these crimes are hidden beneath a surface of respectability and denial. The Viennese medical community reacts with hostility bordering on outrage. Freud presents his theory to the Society for Psychiatry and Neurology in April 1896. The lecture is received coldly. Krafft-Ebing, the chairman and author of Psychopathia Sexualis, the era's most comprehensive study of sexual deviance, calls Freud's theory a scientific fairy tale. Colleagues avoid Freud after the lecture. No one congratulates him. No one asks for clarification or additional evidence. The silence is damning. Freud's practice suffers. Patients stop coming. Referrals dry up. He has positioned himself as the man accusing the entire upper-middle class of Vienna of incest and child abuse. Whether the accusations are true becomes irrelevant. No respectable family wants to consult a physician who might interpret their problems as evidence of sexual abuse. No physician wants to refer patients to someone whose theories threaten social stability and familial reputation. Freud becomes isolated professionally and increasingly desperate financially. Martha is pregnant again. The children need food, clothing, education. The apartment rent is due. Freud's income has plummeted. He writes to his friend Wilhelm Fliess, a Berlin physician with whom he corresponds intensely, describing his situation in bleak terms. He is depressed, anxious about money, and beginning to doubt whether his theories are correct. Then in October 1896, Jacob Freud dies. Sigmund is 40 years old. He has been visiting his parents more frequently as Jacob's health deteriorated, sitting with his father, talking when Jacob had the strength, mostly just being present. But on the day Jacob dies, Sigmund arrives too late. He sees his father's body but does not witness the moment of death. He will later interpret this lateness as unconsciously motivated, as an avoidance of confronting death directly. The death affects Freud profoundly in ways that surprise him. He expects grief, and grief comes, but it is mixed with other emotions. Relief that Jacob's suffering has ended, guilt about feeling relief, and a strange sense of liberation. Jacob's passivity and defeats have always embarrassed Freud. Now, Jacob is gone, and Freud is free from the embarrassment, free from the need to reconcile his ambitions with his father's failures. Freud will later write that a father's death is the most important event, the most poignant loss of a man's life. He describes it as removing the barrier between a man and his own mortality. As long as the father is alive, the son remains a son, junior and protected. When the father dies, the son becomes the patriarch, next in line to face death. The experience forces confrontation with mortality and legacy. What will I leave behind? Something shifts in Freud during the period of mourning. He begins analyzing his own dreams, memories, and emotional responses with the same intensity he applied to patients. He keeps a dream diary, recording dreams immediately upon waking and then free associating to their elements. He notices that his dreams often feature wishes, sometimes obvious, sometimes disguised. He dreams of professional success, of humiliating rivals, of sexual conquests. The dreams reveal desires he does not acknowledge while awake, wishes that seem petty or unacceptable but that clearly drive his behavior unconsciously. In September 1897, less than a year after his father's death, Freud writes a letter to Wilhelm Fliess that represents one of the most controversial moments in the history of psychology. "I no longer believe in my neurotica," he writes, using the Latin term for his neurosis theory. He is abandoning the seduction theory. He no longer believes his patients were actually sexually abused as children. Instead, he now proposes they are reporting fantasies, childhood wishes that they have confused with memories or elaborated into false narratives. The reasons Freud gives for this reversal are multiple and, to later critics, unconvincing. He says it seems implausible that childhood sexual abuse is as common as his theory requires. If every neurotic patient was abused, that would mean abuse is nearly universal among the respectable classes, which strains credibility. He argues that in unconscious mental processes, reality cannot be distinguished from fiction, that the unconscious treats fantasies and memories identically. He notes that even after intensive therapeutic work, complete memories of seduction do not emerge. Instead, patients report fragments and reconstructions that may be therapeutic fabrications rather than recovered truths. But the timing is suspicious. The abandonment of the seduction theory comes during the period when Freud is mourning his father, analyzing himself intensely, and reconsidering everything he believes. Decades later, critics will argue that Freud abandoned the seduction theory not because evidence contradicted it, but because the implications were too disturbing. If the theory was true, then Freud would have to confront the possibility that his own father might have been an abuser, or that Freud himself harbored fantasies of his father's guilt. The theory threatened too many fathers, including the father Freud was trying to mourn and honor. So instead of accusing fathers, Freud shifted blame to children, reinterpreting abuse reports as childish fantasies expressing prohibited desires. Whether this interpretation is fair remains one of the great unresolved debates about Freud. What is certain is that the abandonment of the seduction theory leads directly to Freud's most influential and controversial idea, the Oedipus complex. If children are not passive victims but active desirers, if their reports of seduction are fantasies rather than memories, then children must have sexual feelings toward their parents. The boy desires the mother, sees the father as rival, fantasizes about killing the father and possessing the mother. This desire is universal, inevitable, and the source of civilization's discontents. Freud begins writing The Interpretation of Dreams during this period of intense self-analysis following his father's death. The book, published in November 1899 but dated 1900 to mark the new century, is unlike anything that came before in psychology or psychiatry. It proposes that dreams are not meaningless neural noise, not random images generated by a sleeping brain, but wish fulfillments, coded messages from the unconscious, revealing desires too threatening to acknowledge while awake. The method Freud develops for decoding dreams involves free association. The dreamer reports the dream, then says whatever comes to mind about each element without censorship or logical organization. The associations lead away from the manifest content of the dream, the surface story, toward the latent content, the hidden wish the dream is fulfilling in disguised form. Freud demonstrates the technique by analyzing his own dreams, exposing his wishes for professional success, his resentment toward rivals, his sexual desires, his conflicts about his father. One dream becomes central to the book and to Freud's self-understanding. He dreams of seeing his father with a deathly expression, as though asleep or dead. The image disturbs him deeply. Through analysis, Freud traces the dream to wishes he had during his father's final illness. He wished his father would die to end the suffering, a conscious wish he can acknowledge. But beneath that lies a deeper wish from childhood, the wish that the father would disappear so the boy could have exclusive possession of the mother. The dream confirms for Freud that he experienced the Oedipus complex, that his theory is grounded in his own unconscious life, not just clinical observations of patients. The interpretation of dreams sells poorly at first. 600 copies are printed. It takes 8 years to sell them. Reviews are mixed at best. The scientific community is skeptical. How can one verify that a dream means what Freud claims it means? The method seems subjective, interpretive, too dependent on the analyst's creativity. The general public finds the emphasis on sexual wishes disturbing. Freud seems obsessed with sex, finding phallic symbols and incestuous desires everywhere. Respectable readers are offended by his claim that innocent-seeming dreams about climbing stairs or opening doors are really about sexual intercourse. But slowly, the book begins to attract followers. Young physicians and intellectuals in Vienna and beyond read it and find themselves convinced that Freud has discovered something real, that beneath the bewildering surface of dreams lies a hidden logic, that the unconscious is not chaos but organized according to its own principles. By 1902, a group begins meeting at Freud's apartment every Wednesday evening. They call themselves the Wednesday Psychological Society. The members include Alfred Adler, a physician interested in organ inferiority and compensation, Wilhelm Stekel, who contributes ideas about symbolism, Rudolf Reitler, and Max Kahane. They discuss case studies, debate theory, and gradually develop what Freud starts calling psychoanalysis, a distinct method and body of knowledge separate from conventional medicine and academic psychology. The early Wednesday evening meetings have a ritualistic quality. They begin at 8 o'clock sharp. Freud sits in his particular chair beneath shelves of antiquities, surrounded by books. The others arrange themselves in a rough circle. Someone, often Freud but sometimes another member, presents a case or theoretical idea. Discussion follows, sometimes lasting hours. Cigars are smoked, coffee is served. The atmosphere is intense, intellectual, but also hierarchical. Freud is clearly the leader. His interpretations carry more weight than others. When he speaks, others listen with deference. The discussions range widely across psychopathology, normal psychology, literature, and culture. The members analyze each other's dreams, interpret slips of the tongue, discuss their patients' resistances and transferences. Gradually, a shared vocabulary emerges: unconscious, repression, resistance, transference, dream work, condensation, displacement. These terms, initially descriptive shorthand for observed phenomena, become theoretical constructs, building blocks of a system. But tensions are present from the start. Freud does not tolerate dissent well. When someone disagrees too strongly, Freud does not treat it as legitimate intellectual disagreement. Instead, he interprets the disagreement as evidence of resistance, as a psychological defense mechanism preventing the dissenter from accepting painful truths. If Adler questions the primacy of sexuality in neurosis, Freud suggests that Adler's own neurotic conflicts prevent him from acknowledging sexual truth. The interpretive method that works therapeutically becomes a weapon in theoretical disputes, pathologizing disagreement and making it nearly impossible to challenge core tenets without being accused of psychological blindness. In 1905, Freud publishes 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, the most scandalous and influential work of his career. The book proposes that sexuality does not begin at puberty but exists from infancy, that sexual development proceeds through stages organized around different body zones, and that adult neuroses result from fixations at early stages or conflicts during development. The first essay discusses sexual aberrations, analyzing homosexuality, fetishism, sadism, and masochism, not as signs of degeneracy but as developmental variations. Freud argues that heterosexual genital sexuality is not natural or instinctive, but constructed through a complex developmental process. Everyone begins with polymorphous perverse potential, capable of taking sexual pleasure from any part of the body and any kind of stimulation. Adult sexuality is the outcome of development channeling this diffuse potential into socially acceptable forms. The second essay introduces the concept of infantile sexuality, the idea that babies and children experience sexual feelings organized around bodily zones and functions. The oral stage, from birth to about 18 months, is organized around the mouth and the pleasures of sucking. The anal stage, from 18 months to 3 years, is organized around bowel control and the pleasures of retention and expulsion. The phallic stage, from 3 to 6 years, is organized around the genitals and masturbation. During the phallic stage, the Oedipus complex emerges. The boy desires the mother and fears the father will punish this desire by castration. The boy resolves the Oedipus complex by identifying with the father and internalizing paternal authority as the super-ego. The third essay discusses the transformations of puberty, when dormant sexuality reawakens and must be integrated with the emotional and social developments of adolescence. Freud argues that puberty brings new difficulties precisely because earlier conflicts have not been fully resolved, creating vulnerabilities that can produce neurosis under stress. The public reaction is shock and outrage. Victorian culture had constructed childhood as a period of innocence, free from sexual desire. Children were angels, pure beings, unsullied by the corruption that comes with adulthood. Freud is claiming that babies experience pleasure from sucking beyond nutritional need, that toddlers experience pleasure from defecation, and retention, that young children masturbate and experience incestuous desires toward parents. He is describing 3-year-olds having sexual feelings, 6-year-olds fearing castration, infants as sensual beings seeking bodily pleasure. Many readers find the ideas repellent. Critics accuse Freud of projecting adult perversity onto children, of sexualizing innocence, of corrupting the cultural image of childhood. Some call him a pornographer disguising prurient imagination as science. Religious leaders condemn the book as immoral. Even sympathetic reviewers find the material difficult to accept. The idea that a mother nursing an infant is participating in a sexual experience, however unconsciously, seems grotesque. But 3 essays also contains ideas that will prove influential beyond psychoanalysis and beyond Freud's specific formulations. The argument that sexuality is constructed rather than natural, that what appears as fixed adult identity is actually the fragile endpoint of complex development, opens space for understanding sexual variation without immediately pathologizing it. Freud's treatment of homosexuality, while still viewing it as developmental arrest rather than normal variation, is relatively progressive for 1905. He insists that homosexuality is not degeneracy or moral failure but a developmental outcome, that homosexuals are not criminals or perverts but people whose sexual development followed a different path. The scandal helps as much as it hurts. Freud becomes famous, or infamous. People who would never have heard of an obscure Viennese neurologist now know his name. Newspapers write about him, usually negatively, but the publicity draws attention. His practice grows. Patients come from across Europe and eventually from America, seeking the doctor who claims he can cure neurosis by talking about sex and childhood. He begins training analysts, physicians, and educated laypeople who will learn psychoanalytic technique, undergo analysis themselves, and then use the method to treat patients. The training is informal at first, consisting mainly of being analyzed by Freud and attending the Wednesday meetings. Later, it will become more structured, with training institutes and standardized requirements. But in these early years, psychoanalysis spreads through personal connection and intellectual conversion. In 1906, a young Swiss psychiatrist named Carl Jung sends Freud a copy of his book on word association experiments. Jung works at the Burghölzli Hospital in Zurich under Eugen Bleuler, one of the most respected psychiatrists in Europe. Jung has been conducting experiments showing that certain words produce delayed responses and emotional disturbances in subjects, suggesting the existence of unconscious complexes. He sees his experimental work as confirming Freud's theories about unconscious mental processes. Freud is delighted to receive Jung's book and letter. Jung represents several things Freud desperately needs. First, Jung is Gentile, breaking the perception that psychoanalysis is a Jewish science confined to Vienna's Jewish medical community. Second, Jung is handsome, charismatic, and socially at ease in ways Freud is not. Third, Jung works at a major psychiatric institution, giving psychoanalysis legitimacy in academic medicine. And fourth, Jung is young enough, 19 years younger than Freud, to be a son rather than a rival. Freud and Jung begin corresponding intensely, writing long letters, analyzing cases, debating theory, discussing strategy for spreading psychoanalysis. The correspondence has an intensity that suggests both are seeking something beyond intellectual exchange. Freud finds in Jung the son and heir he never had biologically. His own sons are too young and show no interest in psychoanalysis. Jung represents the future of the movement, the next generation who will carry the work forward after Freud dies. They meet in person for the first time in February 1907. The meeting takes place in Vienna, at Freud's apartment. It lasts 13 hours. They talk without stopping, exploring every aspect of psychoanalysis, sharing case studies, debating theoretical fine points. Freud is energized by Jung's enthusiasm and intelligence. Jung is awed by Freud's depth and insight. Each feels he has found someone who truly understands him. By the end of the meeting, Freud has decided that Jung will be his successor. the man who will lead psychoanalysis after Freud is gone. He begins calling Jung his crown prince, the heir apparent to the psychoanalytic kingdom. But the relationship contains tensions from the start, tensions that will eventually destroy it. Jung is interested in mysticism, mythology, alchemy, and the occult. He believes there are spiritual dimensions to the psyche that cannot be reduced to sexuality and childhood trauma. Freud is committed to scientific materialism. He believes that psychoanalysis must remain grounded in biology, that spiritual language is regression to pre-scientific thinking. Jung questions whether all neurosis really reduces to sexual repression. He finds Freud's sexual theory too narrow, too reductive. Freud insists that sexuality is the foundation. Remove that, and psychoanalysis collapses into vague humanism indistinguishable from philosophy or religion. The theoretical differences are compounded by personal dynamics. Jung wants to modify and expand psychoanalysis to make it his own. Freud wants orthodox preservation of core concepts. Jung needs to establish independence to become his own man. Freud needs loyalty to preserve the movement's coherence. These are incompatible needs, though neither recognizes it initially. They both believe that intellectual goodwill and mutual respect can bridge the differences. They are wrong. The psychoanalytic movement is growing rapidly. In 1908, the first International Psychoanalytic Congress meets in Salzburg. 42 psychoanalysts attend from 6 countries: Austria, Germany, Switzerland, England, Hungary, and the United States. They present papers, share clinical techniques, and discuss the challenges of maintaining theoretical coherence as the movement expands into different languages and cultural contexts. Freud delivers a 5-hour lecture on the case of the rat man, a patient obsessed with intrusive thoughts about rats and torture without using notes. The audience is exhausted but impressed by Freud's memory and his ability to weave clinical details into theoretical illumination. In 1909, Freud and Jung traveled together to America, invited to give lectures at Clark University in Massachusetts to celebrate the university's 20th anniversary. The invitation represents a major breakthrough. American psychology has been skeptical of psychoanalysis, dominated by experimental approaches and behaviorism that focus on observable behavior rather than unconscious processes. But G. Stanley Hall, the president of Clark University, and a pioneering psychologist himself, is open to new ideas and curious about Freud's work. The ocean voyage takes 10 days. Freud and Jung spend hours on deck, talking, analyzing each other's dreams, discussing the future of psychoanalysis. The intimacy of the voyage, the isolation from daily responsibilities, creates a hothouse atmosphere. They push each other psychologically, interpreting each other's associations and dreams with the bluntness they would use with patients. The mutual analysis reveals tensions neither has fully acknowledged. Freud is autocratic and controlling. Jung is ambitious and competitive. Each wants the other's recognition but also wants to dominate the relationship. Freud delivers 5 lectures in German at Clark University, introducing psychoanalysis to an American audience largely unfamiliar with his work. He explains the unconscious, repression, the method of free association, dream interpretation, psychosexual development, and the talking cure. The lectures are models of clarity, avoiding technical jargon and using vivid examples to make abstract concepts concrete. He describes how a forgotten name or missed appointment reveals unconscious motives, how a dream about climbing stairs expresses sexual wishes, how a slip of the tongue betrays hidden hostility. The American reception is enthusiastic. William James, the great philosopher and psychologist, attends despite being seriously ill. After Freud's lecture, James tells him, "The future of psychology belongs to your work." James dies a year later, so whether he would have maintained this judgment is unknowable, but in the moment, his endorsement means everything to Freud. It validates psychoanalysis as important to someone outside the movement, someone whose intellectual credentials are unquestionable. But Freud dislikes America itself. He finds it superficial, crudely optimistic in ways that seem naive about human nature and moralistic despite its pretensions to freedom. Americans want psychoanalysis to make them happy, to help them succeed in business and love. They miss the tragic core of Freud's vision, that happiness is not achievable, that civilization depends on instinctual renunciation, that human beings are fundamentally conflicted creatures who cannot get what they want without creating new dissatisfactions. American optimism seems to Freud like denial of reality, and he will later say that America is a gigantic mistake, a civilization built on the repression of tragic truths. Nevertheless, the Clark Lectures establish psychoanalysis in America, where it will eventually flourish far beyond its European roots. American analysts will develop ego psychology, emphasizing adaptation and functioning rather than unconscious conflict. They will create shorter-term therapies focused on symptom relief rather than deep analysis. They will integrate psychoanalysis with American pragmatism and optimism in ways that horrify Freud, but that ensure the survival of psychoanalytic ideas in modified forms. Back in Vienna, cracks are appearing in the psychoanalytic movement. The Wednesday Psychological Society has expanded and formalized, becoming the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, but expansion brings disagreement. In 1911, Alfred Adler, one of the original members, breaks with Freud. Adler has been arguing for several years that the drive for power and superiority is more fundamental than sexuality, that neurosis results from inferiority feelings rather than sexual repression. Adler's focus on power makes sense given his background. He is shorter than average, physically frail, and has overcome childhood illness through determination. His theory generalizes his experience. Humans are driven by the need to overcome weakness and achieve superiority. Freud sees Adler's theory as betrayal of core principles. If sexuality is not primary, if power and inferiority matter more, then the entire structure of psychoanalysis collapses. The Oedipus complex becomes secondary. Infantile sexuality becomes peripheral. The unconscious becomes less important than conscious strivings for achievement. This is unacceptable to Freud. He interprets Adler's dissent not as legitimate theoretical innovation, but as resistance, as Adler's personal inability to confront sexual truths. The Vienna Psychoanalytic Society splits. Meetings become battlegrounds. Freud's loyalists attack Adler's ideas. Adler's supporters defend him. The atmosphere becomes poisonous. Eventually, Adler resigns from the society and founds his own school, individual psychology, taking several members with him. Freud responds with bitterness that will last the rest of his life. He forbids members of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society from attending Adler's meetings or reading his publications. Adler's name becomes unmentionable in Freud's presence. The break is final and absolute. The break with Jung is more painful because the relationship was more important to Freud. Jung publishes work on mythology and symbolism that Freud finds too mystical, too far from the biological foundations of psychoanalysis. Jung analyzes myths and fairy tales, finding in them universal patterns he calls archetypes. He argues that the unconscious contains not only repressed personal memories, but collective inherited structures, a collective unconscious shared by all humanity. Freud finds this concept scientifically untenable, a regression to mysticism disguised as psychology. Jung questions the sexual theory more openly with each publication. In 1912, he publishes Transformations and Symbols of the Libido, reinterpreting libido as general psychic energy rather than specifically sexual energy. For Freud, this is unacceptable compromise. Sexuality is the foundation of psychoanalysis. Everything else, symptoms, dreams, culture, rests on the bedrock of sexual drive-seeking expression and encountering repression. Remove sexuality and the entire edifice collapses into vague generalities about psychic energy and spiritual development. The personal relationship deteriorates in parallel with the theoretical divergence. Freud and Jung exchange increasingly hostile letters. Freud accuses Jung of wanting to kill the father, of needing to overthrow Freud to establish his own authority, of unconsciously enacting the Oedipus complex in their relationship. Jung accuses Freud of being authoritarian, of treating psychoanalysis like a religion with himself as prophet, of being unable to tolerate disagreement or allow followers to develop their own ideas. In 1913, the break becomes final. Jung resigns as president of the International Psychoanalytic Association and severs all contact with Freud. He goes his own way, eventually founding analytical psychology, developing concepts like introversion and extroversion, the collective unconscious, and archetypes. He builds a career independent of Freud, becomes famous in his own right, and never reconciles with the man who called him Crown Prince. The defections of Adler and Jung devastate Freud emotionally and threaten the movement organizationally. He had hoped to build a unified movement, a coherent school that would carry psychoanalysis into the future after he was gone. Instead, the movement is fragmenting. Followers are rejecting core principles and establishing competing schools. The dream of psychoanalysis as a unified science is dying. Freud responds by tightening control over remaining members. He forms a secret committee in 1912, a small group of absolute loyalists including Ernest Jones from England, Karl Abraham from Berlin, Sándor Ferenczi from Budapest, Hans Sachs, and Otto Rank. Each member receives a ring from Freud, a gold ring with an antique Greek gem, symbol of their special bond and commitment to defending psychoanalytic orthodoxy. The committee meets secretly, plans strategy, and decides who is loyal and who is suspect. They function as Freud's inner circle, his palace guard against further defections. The committee structure reveals something important about Freud's psychology and the institutional form psychoanalysis takes. Freud sees himself as a scientific revolutionary, but he runs psychoanalysis like a political movement or religious sect. Loyalty matters more than evidence. Dissent is pathologized rather than engaged. The movement has inner circles and outer circles, initiates and heretics. There are doctrines that must be accepted and interpretations that are forbidden. This structure will shape psychoanalysis for generations, creating an environment where questioning core concepts requires breaking with the institution, where intellectual disagreement means excommunication. World War I begins in August 1914 and disrupts everything. 3 of Freud's sons serve in the Austrian army. Martin, the eldest, serves as an artillery officer. Oliver and Ernst are also conscripted. Freud worries constantly about their safety, reading casualty lists in newspapers, fearing the knock on the door that would announce a son's death. Communication with foreign analysts becomes difficult. Letters take weeks to arrive, if they arrive at all. The international conferences stop. The psychoanalytic publishing house in Vienna struggles financially as paper becomes scarce and readers are distracted by war news. Freud himself supports the Austrian war effort initially, hoping for a strong German-speaking Europe that would provide security for Jews and cultural dominance for Germanic civilization. But as the war drags on and casualties mount into millions, his enthusiasm fades. The war reveals something about human nature that confirms his darkest theories, that beneath the thin veneer of civilization lies aggression that can erupt into mass slaughter, that progress is illusion, that barbarism is always ready to return. The war years are professionally productive despite external chaos. Cut off from international colleagues, Freud focuses on writing. In 1917, he publishes Introductory Lectures on Psychoanalysis, a systematic presentation of psychoanalytic theory based on lectures he delivered to students and educated laypeople at the University of Vienna. The lectures are organized into 3 sections: parapraxis, slips of the tongue and acts of forgetting that reveal unconscious wishes, dreams and their interpretation, and neurosis, its causes and treatment. The book becomes a standard introduction to psychoanalysis, readable and comprehensive, translated into many languages. But the war also brings personal tragedy that will influence Freud's theoretical development. In January 1920, His daughter Sophie dies of influenza during the pandemic that sweeps Europe in the war's aftermath. Sophie is 27, married to a photographer named Max Halberstadt, with 2 young sons. She lives in Hamburg, too far for Freud to reach quickly. He learns of her death by telegram. The suddenness and distance make the loss particularly painful. He cannot attend the funeral because train travel is still disrupted by war's aftermath. Freud is grief-stricken. He writes to colleagues that something has broken in him that will never heal. Sophie was not his favorite child. That position belongs to Anna. But she was vital and beautiful and full of life, and her death seems senseless, a waste. The influenza pandemic killed millions indiscriminately, young and healthy along with old and weak. There is no meaning in it, no justice, just biological process destroying individual lives. The loss of Sophie coincides with a major theoretical shift in Freud's thinking. In 1920, he publishes Beyond the Pleasure Principle, introducing one of his most controversial and speculative concepts, the death drive. Previously, Freud had theorized that all mental activity serves the pleasure principle, seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, seeking discharge of tension and achievement of equilibrium. But observing trauma victims compulsively repeating painful experiences in dreams and waking life, and reflecting on his own grief and depression, Freud proposes a second fundamental drive operating alongside and against the pleasure principle. He calls this drive thanatos, after the Greek personification of death, though he more often uses the German term Todestrieb. The death drive is an urge to return to an inorganic state, to end the tension and stimulation of life, to achieve the absolute equilibrium of non-existence. This drive exists in tension with eros, the life drive, creating an eternal conflict within every organism. Every living thing is pulled simultaneously toward life and death, creation and destruction, binding together and falling apart. Many of Freud's followers find the death drive concept mystical, unnecessary, and inconsistent with earlier theory. It seems unlike his earlier work, more philosophical than scientific, more speculative than empirical, but Freud insists on it with unusual fervor. The death drive explains phenomena the pleasure principle cannot: masochism, the pursuit of pain, self-destructive behavior that serves no apparent purpose, the compulsion to repeat trauma rather than avoid it, the aggression humans direct against themselves and others. The concept also reflects Freud's darker worldview after the war and Sophie's death. The 19th century optimism that science and reason will improve humanity, that civilization is progressive, that the future will be better than the past, all of this has died in the trenches of World War I and the mass graves of the influenza pandemic. Humans are not rational animals gradually conquering irrationality. They are animals with a drive toward death barely held in check by thin civilizing forces. Progress is illusion. Beneath every civilization lies barbarism waiting to return. In 1923, Freud notices a growth in his mouth during a routine self-examination. He has smoked 20 cigars a day for decades, since his early 20s. Ignoring warnings from colleagues that tobacco might be dangerous, the growth is irregular, painful when touched, and clearly abnormal. He shows it to a physician who recommends immediate biopsy. The result is cancer, specifically squamous cell carcinoma of the jaw and palate. Surgery is scheduled. The first operation removes part of Freud's jaw and hard palate. Surgeons replace the removed bone and tissue with a metal prosthetic device that separates his mouth from his nasal cavity, allowing him to speak and eat. The prosthetic is uncomfortable, requiring constant adjustment. It causes pain, interferes with eating, and distorts his speech. Freud will undergo 33 operations over the next 16 years as the cancer repeatedly returns, and surgeons attempt to remove it while preserving as much function as possible. Despite the pain and the difficulty speaking, Freud continues working. He sees patients, though fewer than before and for shorter sessions. He writes extensively, producing some of his most important theoretical works during the cancer years. The pain is managed with aspirin and later with increasingly frequent doses of morphine. Max Schur, who becomes his personal physician in 1928, monitors his condition and adjusts medication to balance pain relief against mental clarity. In 1923, the same year the cancer is diagnosed, Freud publishes The Ego and the Id, introducing the structural model that will become standard psychoanalytic theory. He proposes that the mind contains three agencies or structures, each with different functions and following different principles. The ID is the reservoir of instinctual drives, the psychic representative of biological needs. It operates according to the pleasure principle, seeking immediate gratification without regard for reality or morality. It is unconscious, chaotic, and amoral. The id wants what it wants and cares nothing for consequences. The superego is the internalized voice of parental and social authority, the repository of moral rules and prohibitions. It develops during the resolution of the Oedipus complex, when the child internalizes the father's authority and social norms to manage instinctual drives. The superego enforces conscience, creates guilt, and punishes transgressions through feelings of shame and worthlessness. The ego is the conscious self that mediates between ID demands, superego prohibitions, and external reality. The ego operates according to the reality principle, seeking satisfaction of drives in ways that are possible and socially acceptable. The ego uses defense mechanisms, unconscious strategies, for managing anxiety created by conflicts between ID, superego, and reality. The structural model is more dynamic than the earlier topographical model that divided the mind into conscious, preconscious, and unconscious regions. The new model emphasizes ongoing conflict and the ego's constant struggle to find compromises that satisfy incompatible demands. The ego is not in charge of the psyche. It is besieged from multiple directions, trying to satisfy the id without violating the superego while adapting to reality's constraints. Neurosis results when the ego's defense mechanisms cannot adequately manage these conflicting demands, when repression fails and anxiety breaks through. The 1920s and 1930s are Freud's period of greatest cultural influence, despite his physical decline. Psychoanalysis spreads through Europe and America, no longer confined to medical circles, but penetrating art, literature, and popular culture. Training institutes open in Berlin, London, Vienna, and New York, offering standardized programs to educate new analysts. Artists and writers engage with Freudian ideas, sometimes supportively, sometimes critically, but always recognizing psychoanalysis as a force that must be confronted. Surrealists claim Freud as inspiration for their exploration of unconscious imagery and dreams. André Breton writes to Freud expressing admiration and inviting him to collaborate. Salvador Dali creates paintings inspired by psychoanalytic concepts, but Freud dislikes surrealism, finding it too deliberate, too consciously constructed. The unconscious, Freud believes, reveals itself in slips and symptoms, not in calculated attempts to represent it artistically. Novelists use stream of consciousness techniques influenced by Freud's emphasis on unconscious thought. James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, and Marcel Proust create narratives that follow associations and memories rather than linear plots, representing subjective experience in ways that psychoanalysis made thinkable. Literary critics begin using psychoanalytic concepts to interpret texts, finding Oedipal conflicts in Hamlet, sexual symbolism in poetry, unconscious meanings beneath surface narratives. The educated public begins using Freudian vocabulary in everyday conversation. People speak casually about ego, libido, Freudian slips, defense mechanisms, and repression. The concepts have entered common language, often in simplified or distorted forms, but their presence indicates that Freud has changed how people think about themselves. But this popularization troubles Freud. Psychoanalysis is being simplified and distorted in ways that miss essential complexities. Americans especially are adapting psychoanalysis in ways Freud considers wrong. American analysts emphasize ego psychology and adaptation to society, downplaying sexuality and aggression. They promote psychoanalysis as a path to happiness and success rather than a method for confronting painful truths. They integrate psychoanalysis with American optimism and self-improvement culture. Freud believes they are creating a shallow, optimistic version that misses the tragic core of his vision. In 1930, Freud publishes Civilization and Its Discontents, his most pessimistic and perhaps most profound work. The book argues that civilization and happiness are fundamentally incompatible. Civilization requires instinctual renunciation. To live in society, humans must repress aggressive and sexual drives. They must defer gratification, control impulses, submit to authority. This renunciation creates permanent discontent, an unavoidable unhappiness built into civilized existence. The more advanced the civilization, the more instinctual renunciation it requires, and therefore the greater the discontent. Primitive societies allow more direct expression of aggression and sexuality, but provide less security and material comfort. Advanced civilizations provide security and comfort, but require massive repression that creates neurosis, anxiety, and depression. There is no solution to this dilemma. Civilization depends on instinctual renunciation, but renunciation creates suffering. Happiness and civilization are incompatible. The book reflects not only Freud's theoretical development, but also the political situation in Europe. The Great Depression has created mass unemployment and economic desperation. Extremist movements are growing, offering simple solutions to complex problems. In Germany, the Nazi Party is gaining power, exploiting economic distress and channeling resentment towards scapegoats, particularly Jews. Freud watches with dread. He knows what Nazi ideology means for Jews. Hitler has made his intentions clear in Mein Kampf and in speeches calling for racial purification. Civilization and Its Discontents reads like a premonition of the catastrophe approaching. The book argues that aggression is a fundamental human drive, that civilization can repress it, but never eliminate it, that repressed aggression accumulates until it explodes in violence. Freud is describing, though he does not say so explicitly, the psychological conditions that make fascism possible: resentment seeking outlets, repressed aggression seeking targets, the pleasure of destroying scapegoats. Freud's mother, Amalia, dies in 1930 at age 95. Freud is 74, old himself, already suffering from cancer. He writes to colleagues that Amalia's death affects him strangely. He does not feel the grief he expected. Instead, he feels liberated, as though a weight has been removed. Her death means he no longer has to be the golden Siggy, the special child destined for greatness. He can simply be himself, an old man dying of cancer. He reflects on the contrast with his response to his father's death. Jacob's death devastated him, triggered intense self-analysis, changed his theories. Amalia's death brings relief. Perhaps the relief comes because Amalia lived long enough that Freud no longer needed her approval. He achieved the greatness she predicted. He became famous. He no longer needs her to tell him he is special. Or perhaps the relief comes because their relationship was suffocating in ways Jacob's never was. Amalia's love was overwhelming, demanding, possessive. Her death releases him from obligations he has carried his entire life. In January 1933, the Nazis come to power in Germany. Hitler is appointed chancellor, and within months, the Nazis have consolidated control, eliminating opposition and beginning to implement their racial ideology. On May 10, 1933, the Nazis organized public book burnings in Berlin and other German cities. Students and SA members throw books by Jewish, communist and modernist authors into bonfires while crowds cheer. Freud's works are among those burned, tossed into flames while propagandists denounce psychoanalysis as Jewish pseudoscience, degenerate thought that weakens Aryan vitality. Freud writes to a correspondent, "What progress we are making. In the Middle Ages they would have burned me. Now they are content with burning my books." The sarcasm masks real danger. The Nazis are not content with burning books. Jewish analysts in Germany are dismissed from positions, forbidden to practice, forced into exile. The Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute, once the most active and innovative center of psychoanalytic research and training, closes. Its library is confiscated. Analysts flee to London, Paris, and New York, carrying psychoanalysis with them into exile. Freud remains in Vienna, believing Austria will stay independent, that the worst will not happen there. Austria has its own fascist government under Engelbert Dollfuss, but Dollfuss is Catholic and Austrian nationalist, opposing both socialists and Nazis. Freud hopes that Austrian nationalism will resist German annexation, that Vienna will remain a refuge. He is wrong. On March 11, 1938, German troops mass at the Austrian border. Hitler demands that Austria accept Anschluss, union with Germany, or face invasion. The Austrian government capitulates. On March 12, German troops cross the border unopposed. Crowds in Vienna welcome them with cheers and Nazi salutes. The Anschluss, the annexation of Austria into Nazi Germany, is complete within hours, achieving without violence what had been attempted and failed in 1934. Vienna's Jews immediately face persecution. Stormtroopers raid Jewish homes and businesses, looting and destroying property. Jews are dragged into the streets and forced to scrub pavements with toothbrushes while crowds mock them. Synagogues are vandalized. Jewish professionals are forbidden to practice. Jewish children are expelled from schools. Freud's apartment is searched on March 15th by Gestapo agents looking for evidence of anti-Nazi activity. They find nothing incriminating. Freud maintains icy composure during the search, refusing to show fear. The agents confiscate some money, about 6,000 shillings, from a safe, but leave without arresting anyone. 3 days later, Anna Freud, Sigmund's youngest daughter and his most devoted follower, is taken to Gestapo headquarters for questioning. She is interrogated for hours about her father's connections and the psychoanalytic movement. She returns home that evening, shaken but physically unharmed. The experience terrifies Freud more than the search of his apartment. He can endure his own persecution, but Anna's danger breaks through his denial. Freud's international friends mobilize frantically to get him out. Ernest Jones in London negotiates with British authorities to secure entry visas for Freud, his family, and his household. Marie Bonaparte, a French princess and psychoanalytic patient of Freud's, uses her wealth and connections to pressure Nazi officials. She travels to Vienna personally, bringing money to pay ransoms and bribes. The Americans offer visas, but Freud prefers London, closer to the psychoanalytic community he knows. But Freud resists leaving even as danger intensifies. He is 82 years old. He has lived in Vienna for 78 years, nearly his entire life. The apartment at Berggasse 19 contains everything he knows. His library, his antiquities, his consulting room where thousands of patients have lain on the couch. The idea of starting over in a foreign country, in a language he reads but does not speak fluently, seems impossible. He tells colleagues he is too old to move, that he would rather die in Vienna than live in exile. He writes in his diary, "Finis Austriae," the end of Austria, but he does not pack. The Gestapo does not intend to let him choose his fate. They demand he sign a statement confirming he has been treated well by the German authorities and has no complaints. It is propaganda meant to show the world that Jews are not being persecuted, that Freud himself endorses the new regime. Freud reportedly writes, "I can heartily recommend the Gestapo to anyone." Whether he actually wrote these exact words is disputed, and the document may not have survived, but the story captures his defiant sarcasm even in extremity. Marie Bonaparte pays an enormous ransom to Nazi officials for permission to let Freud leave. The amount is 4,920 Reichsmarks, approximately 2/3 of everything Freud owns. The ransom is extortion. The Nazis seizing Jewish wealth under pretense of taxation, but Marie pays without hesitation. Freud's life is worth far more than money. On June 4, 1938, Freud, his wife Martha, his daughter Anna, his maid Paula Fichtel, and his beloved chow dog Lun depart Vienna by train, travelling to Paris and then to London. 4 of Freud's sisters remain in Vienna: Rosa, Marie, Adolphine, and Paula. They are too old to travel, or too attached to Vienna, or unable to obtain visas. Freud arranges for them to receive money and tries to secure their emigration, but bureaucracy moves slowly and danger moves faster. All 4 will die in Nazi concentration camps. Rosa in Treblinka, Marie in Theresienstadt, Adolphine in Treblinka, Paula in Theresienstadt. Freud will not learn of their deaths. He dies in September 1939, before the systematic extermination fully begins. His sisters' fates remain unknown to him, a mercy perhaps, though their absence from London must have haunted him. Freud's arrival in London on June 6, 1938 is a media event. Journalists and photographers crowd the train station. The frail old man with his distorted jaw and his dog becomes an international symbol of intellectual resistance to fascism. Newspapers run photographs and stories. The British government expedites his residency. The psychoanalytic community welcomes him with relief and reverence. He is installed in a house at 20 Marsfield Gardens in Hampstead, a quiet, affluent neighbourhood in North London. The house is comfortable, larger than the Vienna apartment, with a garden where Freud can sit in good weather. His furniture arrives from Vienna, shipped thanks to Marie Bonaparte's negotiations. The antiquities, the desk, the bookcases, the famous couch with its Persian rug, all are arranged in the new consulting room as they were in Vienna. Freud insists on exact replication. The room must be the same. If he cannot live in Vienna, he will recreate Vienna in London. But he is dying. The cancer has spread beyond the jaw. The surgeries are no longer effective at controlling it. His mouth is a constant source of pain, the tissue necrotizing, the prosthetic device increasingly inadequate. He smells the decay of his own flesh. He can see patients only occasionally, and talking exhausts him. He continues writing when he has the strength, working on Moses and Monotheism, a speculative work that has obsessed him for years. Moses and Monotheism, published in full in 1939, is one of Freud's strangest and most controversial works. He argues that Moses was actually Egyptian, not Hebrew, and that Judaism originated from the Egyptian monotheism of Akhenaten. According to Freud's reconstruction, Moses was a follower of Akhenaten who brought monotheism to the Hebrew slaves in Egypt. The Hebrews later killed Moses in a rebellion, repressed the memory of the murder, and spent subsequent millennia unconsciously atoning for the crime through religious ritual and ethical law. The argument is historically questionable, to put it mildly. Scholars of ancient Egypt and Jewish history find little evidence for Freud's claims, but Freud publishes the work anyway, knowing it will offend Jews and Christians alike, perhaps because he is dying and no longer cares about controversy, perhaps because he has always identified as culturally Jewish while rejecting religion intellectually, and this is his final attempt to understand that complex identity. Or perhaps because to the end, Freud insists on saying what he believes regardless of who it offends, regardless of evidence, following intuitions that seem psychologically compelling even when historically unsupported. In August 1939, war becomes inevitable. Hitler demands territorial concessions from Poland. The British and French warn that invading Poland will mean war. Hitler invades Poland on September 1st. Britain and France declare war on Germany on September 3rd. The Second World War has begun, the catastrophe Freud predicted and dreaded, the return of barbarism on a scale that makes the First World War seem restrained. Freud watches from his house in Hampstead, reading newspapers, listening to radio reports, understanding that everything he feared is happening. Civilization contains barbarism at its core. The death drive is real. Humans will always return to violence and destruction. Repression fails and aggression erupts. His pessimism is vindicated, but the vindication brings no satisfaction, only despair. The cancer becomes unbearable. The pain cannot be adequately controlled without rendering him unconscious. His jaw is largely gone, replaced by agonizing dead tissue. He can barely eat. Speaking is torture. Max Schur, his physician, has promised for years to help when the time comes. On September 21st, Freud tells Schur clearly that continuing is pointless, that there is only torture left, no possibility of meaningful life or work. He asks Schur to fulfill his promise. Schur understands. They have discussed this moment for years, philosophically and practically. Freud has been clear: when life becomes only suffering, when the mind can no longer function, he wants release. Schur administers morphine in a dose calculated to bring relief and unconsciousness. Freud slips into a coma. Schur administers another dose the following day. Freud never wakes. He dies on September 23, 1939 at 3 in the morning. His body is cremated at Golders Green Crematorium on September 26th. Ernest Jones delivers a eulogy, speaking of Freud's courage, his intellectual integrity, his refusal to compromise with comfortable illusions. The urn containing Freud's ashes is placed in a Greek vase from his collection, a red figure crater decorated with Dionysian figures, the god of wine, madness, ecstasy, and the unconscious forces that civilization tries to contain. It is a fitting vessel for the man who spent his life exploring the dark, irrational forces beneath civilized consciousness. Now we see the full arc. The boy from Freiburg, the wool merchant's son, the Jewish outsider, excluded from full participation in Viennese society despite his brilliance, created a theory that explained why people suffer, why they repeat destructive patterns, why they cannot simply choose to be rational and happy. He proposed that beneath consciousness lies a realm of drives and wishes that shape behavior in ways we cannot control or even recognize. He argued that childhood experiences imprint patterns that last a lifetime, that sexuality begins in infancy and organizes psychological development, that dreams reveal hidden desires, that civilization depends on renouncing instinct and creates perpetual discontent. Much of what Freud proposed is wrong in detail. The Oedipus complex as universal structure is not supported by cross-cultural evidence. Anthropologists studying matrilineal societies and cultures with different family structures find that the specific dynamics Freud described are not universal but culturally specific. Penis envy as the defining trauma of female development is rejected by virtually all contemporary psychologists as both empirically unsupported and theoretically incoherent. The death drive remains controversial even among psychoanalysts, many of whom reject it as speculative metaphysics incompatible with clinical observation. Freud's case studies, when they can be checked against independent evidence, often show that his patients did not actually recover, as he claimed. The Rat Man continued suffering obsessive thoughts. Dora, the patient Freud described as cured of hysteria, remained symptomatic and later told others that Freud's treatment helped little. The Wolfman, supported financially by Freud and later by psychoanalytic societies, underwent decades of analysis without achieving the cure Freud claimed. The scientific status of psychoanalysis is disputed. It does not meet the criteria of falsifiability that Karl Popper proposed for distinguishing science from pseudoscience. Psychoanalytic claims are formulated in ways that cannot be definitively disproven. If a patient confirms an interpretation, it validates the theory. If a patient denies an interpretation, that denial is evidence of resistance, which also validates the theory. This structure makes psychoanalysis immune to evidence, capable of explaining any outcome in its own terms. Yet something in Freud's vision endures, the idea that we are not transparent to ourselves, that we harbor motives and desires we do not acknowledge, that the past shapes the present in unconscious ways. These insights have been absorbed into Western culture so thoroughly that they seem obvious. We speak casually of being in denial, of projection, of rationalizing behavior after the fact. We assume childhood experiences matter for adult psychology in profound ways. We treat dreams as potentially meaningful rather than random neural noise. None of these ideas was obvious before Freud. The question that drove Freud was why humans suffer psychologically when there is no physical cause. Why does a woman become paralyzed when her nerves are intact? Why does a man compulsively wash his hands despite knowing they are clean? Why do people repeat relationships that cause them pain? The answers Freud proposed involved unconscious conflicts, repressed memories, and drives seeking expression through indirect pathways. Modern neuroscience uses different language, speaks of neural networks, information processing, and brain systems, but the puzzle Freud identified remains. Mental states affect physical states and behavior in ways that bypass conscious control. We know more now about neurotransmitters and brain structures, but the fundamental mystery of how subjective experience arises from neural activity and how unconscious processes shape behavior remains incompletely solved. Psychoanalysis as therapy has largely been replaced by shorter-term approaches with better empirical support. Cognitive behavioral therapy directly challenges maladaptive thought patterns. Medication treats chemical imbalances. EMDR processes traumatic memories. These approaches produce measurable improvements faster and cheaper than traditional psychoanalysis. But psychodynamic therapy, the descendant of psychoanalysis modified to fit current evidence, still treats patients who do not respond to other methods. The core technique, talking to make unconscious patterns conscious, exploring how past relationships shape present behavior, recognizing defense mechanisms and working through them, this survives in altered form. And for some patients, particularly those with complex interpersonal difficulties and chronic patterns of self-sabotage, psychodynamic approaches remain effective when other methods fail. Freud's greatest legacy may be outside psychology. Literary critics use psychoanalytic concepts to interpret texts, finding unconscious meanings beneath surface narratives, analyzing how authors' conflicts shape their work, exploring how readers' psychological needs influence interpretation. Film theorists analyze how movies activate unconscious desires and fears, how editing and framing manipulate psychic processes, how narrative satisfies wishes the audience cannot acknowledge. Philosophers examine the limits of rational self-knowledge, questioning whether humans can ever fully understand their own motivations, whether consciousness can encompass itself. Historians study how repressed conflicts shape political movements, how collective traumas influence national identities, how psychological mechanisms operate at societal levels. These applications would not exist without Freud's insistence that beneath the surface lies depth, that the obvious is not the whole truth. But we must also acknowledge what Freud got wrong and the harm that followed. The abandonment of the seduction theory meant that for decades, psychoanalysts dismissed reports of actual childhood abuse as fantasy. Women who came to therapy describing incest were told They were expressing Oedipal wishes rather than reporting real trauma. Children's testimony about abuse was discounted as fantasy fulfillment. The damage from this theoretical error is incalculable, measured in lives damaged by abuse that professionals refuse to acknowledge. Only in the 1970s and 1980s, with the work of feminists and trauma researchers, did psychology begin to take abuse seriously again, as external event rather than internal fantasy. The recognition that trauma is real, that it comes from outside rather than inside, required rejecting Freud's revision and returning to something closer to the seduction theory he abandoned. This recognition came too late for many victims whose suffering was invalidated by analysts trained in Freudian orthodoxy. Freud's theory of female sexuality, centered on penis envy and describing women as incomplete men who must accept their lack and compensate through childbearing, reinforced misogyny in clinical practice for generations. Psychoanalysts diagnosed women who rejected traditional roles as suffering from neurosis, as having failed to resolve penis envy or achieve mature femininity, defined as passive receptivity. Women's anger was pathologized. Women's ambitions were interpreted as compensations for anatomical deficiency. The theory provided pseudo-scientific justification for enforcing gender conformity. Freud himself acknowledged he did not understand women, calling the question of what women want the great question that has never been answered, despite decades of investigation. But he theorized about women anyway, and his theories were used to enforce conformity, to dismiss women's complaints, to justify excluding them from opportunities. The harm done by psychoanalytic theories of femininity is enormous, though difficult to quantify precisely because it operated through clinical interactions and cultural influence rather than overt violence. The structure of psychoanalytic training, with its emphasis on orthodoxy, its pathologizing of dissent, its requirement that analysts undergo analysis themselves, creating dependencies and loyalties, this structure created an insular world resistant to external criticism. When empirical studies failed to support psychoanalytic claims, analysts dismissed the studies as applying inappropriate standards, as missing the depth that only analysis could reveal. The movement Freud built became a closed system that could not be corrected by evidence from outside. Yet even these failures are instructive. They show the danger of putting theoretical elegance above empirical testing, of letting the desire for a comprehensive system override attention to anomalies and contradictions, of building movements around charismatic leaders rather than collaborative investigation. Science progresses by abandoning wrong theories when evidence contradicts them, not by defending theories through increasingly elaborate reinterpretations. Psychoanalysis, structured as Freud structured it, could not do this easily. We return to the image we began with, the old man dying in Hampstead, surrounded by his antiquities, asking his doctor to end the suffering. The 16 years of surgery, the 33 operations, the cancer eating away his face, the morphine bringing final relief. Beside his bed, Balzac's book about wishes bringing death. The irony would not have escaped Freud. He built a theory on wish fulfillment, on the idea that wishes organize mental life, and his final conscious act is a wish for death fulfilled. But there is another irony, perhaps deeper. Freud wanted to be remembered as a scientist, as the Newton or Darwin of psychology, as someone who discovered laws of mental functioning that would stand for centuries. He insisted psychoanalysis was natural science, that it would eventually be grounded in neurology and biochemistry, that future researchers would find the brain mechanisms underlying the processes he described. Instead, he is remembered as an interpreter, a storyteller who created compelling narratives about why people suffer. The case studies read like literature with protagonists, conflicts, and resolutions. The theories are not hypotheses rigorously tested against controlled data, but interpretive frameworks applied to clinical experience and cultural observation. Freud tried to be a scientist but succeeded at being a humanist, and this mismatch between aspiration and achievement defines his legacy. Perhaps this is the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Freud's legacy. He wanted to create a science but created a hermeneutic practice, a way of reading human behavior for hidden meanings. Science seeks laws that explain and predict. Hermeneutic seeks meanings that illuminate and deepen understanding. Both are valuable, but they are not the same thing. Freud tried to be both and succeeded at being the latter, while insisting he was the former. The question of whether Freud's theories are true in a scientific sense may be less important than whether they are useful for understanding. Does the concept of the unconscious help make sense of self-deception, of the gap between what people say and what they do? Does the idea of defense mechanisms illuminate how people avoid confronting painful truths? Does attention to childhood experience and family dynamics help explain adult patterns of relating? If the answers are yes, then Freud's work has value regardless of whether his specific mechanisms are neurologically accurate. What cannot be disputed is that Freud changed the conversation permanently. Before him, Western culture assumed that human beings are fundamentally rational, that consciousness is transparent, that people generally know why they do what they do. After Freud, none of these assumptions is tenable. We know that much of mental life is inaccessible to consciousness, that people constantly deceive themselves about their motives, that the reasons given for behavior are often rationalizations constructed after the fact rather than actual causes. This insight is both liberating and disturbing. Liberating because it suggests that irrational behavior is not moral failure but psychological mechanism, that people who repeat self-destructive patterns are not weak-willed but following unconscious scripts. Disturbing because it undermines the belief in rational agency and autonomous choice. If much of what we do is determined by unconscious forces shaped in childhood, how much freedom do we really have? Freud did not resolve this tension between determinism and agency. He argued that psychoanalysis could expand the domain of consciousness, that where I'd was, ego shall be, that making unconscious patterns conscious creates choice where compulsion existed before. But he also emphasized the limits of self-knowledge, insisting that the unconscious could never be made fully conscious, that repression would always return, that civilization would always require renunciation and create discontent. His vision was tragic. Humans are animals with consciousness, aware enough to suffer from their limitations, but not aware enough to transcend them. In the end, Freud's life demonstrates what he theorized, that the past shapes the present, that early experiences create patterns that persist across decades, that ambition and creativity often grow from wounds and conflicts unresolved. The boy who saw his father humiliated and felt ashamed spent his life identifying with conquerors who overthrow authority. The physician who could not cure organic diseases created a method for treating invisible suffering. The Jewish outsider excluded from academic medicine built an alternative institution where he was absolute authority. The son whose father died during a period of theoretical crisis developed a theory making paternal conflict central to human psychology. These are not coincidences or mere biographical details. They are examples of what Freud taught, that our theories about the world are shaped by our experiences, that intellectual work serves psychological needs, that the questions we ask reveal the problems we face. Freud understood this about others but had limited insight into himself. His self-analysis was both courageous and incomplete. He could see some of his patterns, but not all. Even the founder of psychoanalysis could not fully analyze himself, proving his point that self-knowledge has inherent limits. This too is instructive. It suggests that we need others to see what we cannot see in ourselves, that self-examination alone is insufficient. Psychoanalysis in its best form recognizes this, makes it the foundation of the therapeutic relationship. The analyst helps the patient see patterns the patient cannot recognize alone. But Freud's difficulties with dissent, his excommunication of followers who challenged him, suggests he could not fully accept this principle when applied to himself. Perhaps the deepest truth about Freud is that he was brilliant and flawed, insightful and blind, generous and petty, scientific and sectarian simultaneously. He made profound discoveries about human psychology and propagated damaging errors. He relieved suffering and caused suffering. He expanded human self-understanding and created obstacles to further understanding. All of this is true simultaneously. Humans are contradictory. Freud taught that, and his life demonstrates it. The house at 20 Maresfield Gardens where Freud died is now the Freud Museum, open to visitors. You can see the consulting room as it was, the famous couch with its Persian rug and pillows, the desk covered with antiquities, Egyptian gods and Greek heroes watching over the space where thousands of hours of analysis occurred. The room is preserved as though Freud might return at any moment, sit in his chair behind the couch and listen to the next patient's associations. But Freud will not return, and psychoanalysis as he practiced it has mostly disappeared, replaced by faster, more empirically grounded methods. Yet the questions remain. Why do humans suffer psychologically? What drives us beneath conscious awareness? How does the past determine the present? What is the relationship between desire and civilization, between individual needs and social requirements? These are the questions Freud asked, and no one has answered them definitively. His specific answers may be wrong, but the questions endure because they address something fundamental about the human condition. We are animals who became conscious but did not thereby become rational. We are driven by forces we do not understand toward goals we did not consciously choose. We construct narratives about our lives to make them seem coherent, but the narratives are partly fiction, stories we tell ourselves to avoid confronting the chaos beneath. We want to believe we are in control, that we choose our paths, that we understand ourselves. Freud's work suggests we are not, we do not, we cannot, not fully. This message is uncomfortable, which is why Freud remains controversial, why people still argue passionately about whether his work is valuable or dangerous. What seems certain is that Freud matters. More than a century after his major works appeared, we are still arguing about them, still trying to determine what was valuable and what was mistaken, still using Freudian concepts in modified forms, still confronting the questions he raised. A thinker whose work simply vanishes is not a major thinker. Freud's work has not vanished. It has been absorbed, contested, adapted, but not forgotten. The doctor who mapped the darkest corners of the mind did not find light there. He found drives and wishes that civilization must repress, conflicts that cannot be fully resolved, traumas that cannot be undone. He found that self-knowledge is partial and painful, that humans deceive themselves constantly, that consciousness is a small island in an ocean of unconscious processes. He found that love and hate are intertwined, that creation and destruction arise from the same source, that life moves toward death even as it struggles against it. These findings are not scientific laws confirmed by controlled experiment. They are interpretive insights drawn from clinical experience, self-analysis, and cultural observation. They may be wrong in detail, but right in spirit. They capture something true about human psychology, even if they do not capture it with scientific precision. They point toward dimensions of experience that earlier psychology ignored, opening spaces for investigation that continue today in neuroscience, developmental psychology, and psychotherapy. In that sense, Freud succeeded in his deepest ambition. He wanted to be remembered, to write his name in history, to matter beyond his lifetime. He succeeded, absolutely. We are still talking about him, still arguing, still trying to understand what he understood and what he misunderstood. His life demonstrates that greatness and error are not exclusive. that someone can be profoundly wrong about specifics while being profoundly right about the larger picture, that the questions matter even when the answers prove incomplete or mistaken. The man who died requesting morphine from his doctor, who lay surrounded by Greek figurines in a house in London while war consumed Europe, who spent his life investigating suffering without finding a cure, that man changed how we think about being human. Not by solving the problems he identified, but by making them visible, by insisting they matter, by refusing to accept the comfortable lies that consciousness tells about itself. This is what remains, the uncomfortable recognition that we do not fully know ourselves, that much of what drives us is hidden, that the past shapes us in ways we cannot escape, that civilization depends on renouncing instinct, that suffering is built into the human condition not as accident but as structure. Freud did not cause these truths, but he articulated them, made them impossible to ignore, forced Western culture to confront the darkness beneath its rational surface. Whether that confrontation has made us better or merely more anxious is debatable. Whether psychoanalysis helped or harmed more people is unknowable, the calculus too complex for simple judgment. Whether Freud's theories will seem important a century from now is uncertain, dependent on developments we cannot predict. What is certain is that the man who wanted to be a conquistador of the mind succeeded in conquering something, even if it was not what he thought. He conquered the illusion of transparency, the belief that consciousness is all there is, the assumption that rational thought can master instinct and desire. In doing so, he revealed both the depth and the limits of human self-understanding. We can know more than we know spontaneously, but we cannot know everything. We can bring unconscious patterns to awareness, but we cannot eliminate the unconscious. We can analyze the mechanisms of self-deception, but we cannot stop deceiving ourselves. This is the paradox at the heart of Freud's work, and perhaps it is the paradox at the heart of human consciousness itself. The old man lies dying, the morphine flowing through his veins, consciousness fading for the final time. The story ends here on September 23rd, 1939, in a house in Hampstead. But the consequences continue. Everything he wrote, everything he theorized, everything he got right, and everything he got wrong, all of it enters the stream of culture and affects how millions of people understand themselves, not because he was infallible, but because he asked questions that matter and offered answers provocative enough to generate more than a century of argument. This is the legacy of Sigmund Freud, not a finished system, but an ongoing conversation, not a solved puzzle, but a set of productive tensions, not final answers, but enduring questions. The doctor who mapped the darkest corners of the mind did not illuminate them completely, but he showed that they exist, that they matter, that ignoring them comes at a cost. Whether that is enough for greatness depends on what one expects from greatness. If greatness requires being right about everything, Freud falls short. If greatness requires changing the conversation forever, asking questions that cannot be ignored, opening territory for exploration that continues generations later, then Freud succeeds absolutely. And now, in this quiet house in London where an old man has just died, the story concludes. The morphine has done its work. The suffering has ended. The cancer will consume his body no longer. The mind that spent 8 decades investigating the mechanisms of thought has ceased thinking. What remains are books, letters, case studies, theories, an institution, a movement, and a set of questions that will outlive everyone who asked them. This is what humans leave behind, not solutions but traces, not certainty but possibilities, not truth but attempts at truth that others must evaluate, modify, or reject. Freud wanted permanence. He got controversy. Perhaps that is the better outcome. Permanent truths become dogma. Controversy remains alive, generative, capable of producing new insights even through disagreement.